I was standing 12 meters behind Princess Kalindra Thesivorn when she laughed. Not a polite laugh, not the kind of soft, diplomatic amusement that royalty learns to perform at boring state functions when a foreign dignitary says something mildly interesting. No, this was the other kind, the kind that starts somewhere in the chest and bursts out before the person can stop it, the kind that makes everyone nearby turn their heads, because something has struck a nerve so raw and so real that the pretense just collapses. And the thing that made her laugh, the thing that split open all those layers of royal composure, was a human man in old armor. That's where this story starts. In a courtyard, under a yellow sun, with a princess laughing at something that was about to change everything she thought she understood about war. I should probably explain who I am before I go any further, because what I witnessed that day has been reported and misreported so many times across so many star systems that I feel the truth has gotten buried under layers of mythology. My name is Vorin Kalos. I served for 22 cycles as a senior diplomatic attaché for the HFY Confederacy, which means I spent most of my adult life standing in corners at important events, watching powerful people interact with each other, and writing down what actually happened so that future generations wouldn't have to rely on what powerful people said happened. I am good at my job. I am not the kind of person who exaggerates, and I am not the kind of person who misses things. My field evaluation records going back 15 cycles will confirm this. I say this not to sound impressive, but because I want you to understand that what I'm about to describe is not a story that grew in the telling. It's what I saw. It's what I documented, and it is stranger than anything I could have invented. We had come to the human world of Kervith Station as part of the third round of integration negotiations between the HFY Confederacy and the newly admitted Human Coalition. The negotiations themselves were proceeding well enough, slow, careful, full of the usual political maneuvering that these things involve. But the real challenge of the visit was managing Princess Kalindra herself. She was 29 cycles old, which in human terms would be considered something close to their late 20s, though human age is slippery compared to ours. She was the third daughter of Chancellor Imara Salandris, and had been assigned to the delegation not because she had any particular skill in diplomacy. She didn't, at least not yet, but because she had completed her military training 6 months prior, and the Chancellor wanted her to gain exposure to the broader galactic community before she took on any formal command role. What Kalindra had was intelligence. Sharp, restless, almost aggressive intelligence. She asked questions that made people uncomfortable. She spotted weaknesses in arguments before the argument was fully formed. She had a gifted strategic mind that would serve her brilliantly later in her career, but at 29, that mind hadn't yet learned patience. It hadn't learned that some things require time to reveal themselves. It hadn't learned that first appearances in this universe are almost never the whole story. The courtyard ceremony was supposed to be a formality, a welcoming ritual the humans had arranged for our delegation, something involving their traditional honor guard, a display of their ceremonial practices, that sort of thing. We had been briefed that the human military had a custom of presenting visiting delegations with a formal guard of honor, drawn from their most distinguished active personnel. What we were not fully briefed on, what none of us expected, was that the lead honor guard would arrive in what appeared to be antique combat equipment. His name, I would learn later, was Sergeant Major Elias Doer. He was 46 years old by the human counting, which places him somewhere past the middle of a human life, though he carried himself in a way that made that number feel irrelevant. He was not particularly large by human standards, medium height, stocky through the shoulders, with the careful economy of movement that you see in soldiers who have spent decades treating their bodies as tools. His face had the kind of weathered quality that comes not from age but from exposure, from years in atmospheres that were too cold or too hot, from sleeping in places that weren't designed for sleeping, from keeping his eyes open long past the point where other people closed theirs. And he was wearing armor that looked like it belonged in a museum. Not a metaphorical museum, an actual museum, the kind of facility where extinct things are placed behind transparent barriers so that curious visitors can observe what the universe used to contain. The chest plate was a deep, almost charcoal gray, with a surface texture that suggested it had been polished thousands of times without ever quite achieving the smooth perfection of modern plating. It was thick, visibly, obviously thick, in a way that modern combat materials are not, because modern materials derive their protection from density and energy management rather than raw mass. This armor derived its protection from being extremely, almost defiantly solid. The pauldrons, the shoulder guards, were wide and slightly raised, giving Doer a silhouette that looked architectural. The gauntlets were articulated with visible mechanical joints, the kind of engineering that was sophisticated for its era, but was 3 or 4 generations behind what current Confederacy or coalition soldiers wore. There were markings on the armor. That was the first thing I noticed that made me pay closer attention. Not decorative markings, not the kind of ornamental scratching that ceremonial armor sometimes carries. These were functional marks, usage marks, scratches and dents that had been carefully preserved rather than repaired. There was a long diagonal score across the left side of the chest plate that could only have come from something extremely sharp and extremely fast. There were burn shadows along the upper right pauldron that I recognized as the kind of heat staining you get from a near miss with a directed energy discharge. And there were hand-painted identifiers on the inner surfaces of both gauntlets. Small, precise human numerals that I later learned corresponded to a unit designation that no longer existed. The armor was not new. The armor was not ceremonial. The armor was real, and it had been used, and whoever had used it had been in situations that left marks. But none of this registered immediately in the way I'm describing it now. The immediate impression, and I say this honestly, because honesty is the only purpose this document serves, was that the armor looked old. Whatever history it carried, whatever experience was written into its surfaces, the surface impression was of something outdated, something past its time. And that was the impression Princess Kaelindra responded to. She was standing to my left and slightly ahead of me in the welcoming formation, flanked by her 2 senior military advisors, General Thaz Verendry on her right and Field Commander Sora Delm on her left. Both of them were accomplished soldiers with genuine field experience. Both of them had seen more combat than most people in the Confederacy, though neither of them would find out until that day what that experience had actually prepared them to understand. When Sergeant Major Doer walked into the courtyard, Kailindra's reaction was immediate and unguarded. I watched it happen in real time. I watched her eyes travel from his face down to his armor, and I watched the corner of her mouth begin to move. The sound that followed was not cruel, exactly. Kaelindra was not a cruel person, but it was the unmistakable sound of someone who has found something genuinely, helplessly funny. That, she said, in a voice pitched low but not low enough, is what they sent as their ceremonial guard. She was speaking to General Verendry. Verendry made a small, uncomfortable sound, not quite agreement, not quite dissent. He was experienced enough to be cautious. "The armor appears to be," he began. "Old," Kaelindra said, completing his sentence for him. "The armor is old. It's practically excavated." She looked at it again, with the sort of focused attention that she gave to things that interested her, even if what interested her was the absurdity. The joint articulation on those gauntlets, that's at least 4 generations behind current coalition standard, maybe more. And the chest plate, that mass-density approach to ballistic protection, was superseded before either of us was born. She wasn't wrong. That was the thing. She was absolutely, technically, factually not wrong. The armor was old. The engineering principles that had produced it were obsolete, Every specific observation she made about its generation and its relationship to current technology was accurate. She just didn't know what any of that meant yet. Sergeant Major Dower, to his considerable credit, showed no sign of having heard any of this. He came to a halt in the center of the courtyard with a precision that was almost unsettling, not robotic, not mechanical, but exact in the way that only very long practice makes exact. His unit fell in around him with the same quality of movement, and then they stood. They just stood. And somehow, I'm still not entirely sure how to explain this, the standing was impressive. There was something in the stillness that had weight to it. The honor guards I was accustomed to in the Confederacy maintained their positions through discipline and training, and when you watched them long enough, you could see the maintenance. You could see the micro-adjustments, the small compensations that the body makes when it is holding a position it would rather not hold. Dower and his unit showed none of that. They stood like people for whom standing this way was simply what the body did, not an effort, a default state. I made a note of it, not because I knew it was significant yet. Just because it was unusual, and unusual things are worth noting. The welcoming ceremony proceeded. There were speeches. There are always speeches at these events, and there were the ritual exchanges of formal greetings, and there was the presentation of diplomatic tokens that each side had prepared to symbolize goodwill. Kailindra participated with the polished surface-level competence that she was perfectly capable of deploying when the situation required it, even when she found the situation privately ridiculous. But every so often, her eyes moved back to Dower. And every time they did, there was something slightly different in her expression. Not the amusement anymore, or not just the amusement. Something more like the look she got when she encountered a problem she couldn't immediately solve, a calculation running in the back of her mind. I know because I know her face well enough by now. At the time, I noted it without fully understanding it. Looking back, I think some part of her was already doing the work, even then. Some part of her intelligence was already asking questions that her pride hadn't caught up to yet. The ceremony concluded. The formal part of the afternoon was over. And then one of the coalition's senior diplomatic liaisons, a compact, fast-moving woman named Coordinator Perry Aldous, approached our delegation and made an offer that nobody had anticipated. "The Sergeant Major has extended an invitation," she said, addressing the whole delegation but looking at Kailindra with an expression I found impossible to read. "If the Princess's party would care to see a demonstration of the Guard's operational capacity, he'd be pleased to arrange it. Not a performance," she added carefully. "An actual exercise, with real equipment and real parameters." There was a pause. Kailindra looked at me not for permission but for context. I shrugged, which in Thesekai body language means approximately "I have no information to offer, this is your call." She looked at General Verandry. He gave her a very small nod that meant professionally, "You should probably accept this." She looked back at Coordinator Aldous. "We'd be interested," she said. And then, because she couldn't entirely stop herself, "I'm curious to see what that armor does when it moves." Coordinator Aldous smiled. It was a very controlled smile. "You might find the answer to that more interesting than you expect." Part 2, the exercise floor. The demonstration facility was on the lower levels of Kervith Station, below the diplomatic suites and the civilian concourses, in the part of the station that didn't bother pretending to be anything other than a military installation. The corridors were functional, clean, lit with the flat, even illumination that's designed to eliminate shadows rather than create atmosphere. The walls marked with the kind of directional signage that assumes everyone using this space has somewhere specific to be and needs to get there without ambiguity. I had been in military facilities before, many of them. The Thesekai Confederacy runs some of the most sophisticated training installations in the known galaxy, and I had visited several of them as part of diplomatic overview processes. I had seen the kind of equipment that current-generation military forces deploy in training environments. The adaptive simulation chambers, the environmental modifiers, the real-time physiological monitoring systems that track every variable from muscle activation to neural response latency. Kervith's training floor was different from all of those. Not inferior, exactly, but different in ways that I kept catching myself noticing. The space itself was large, a rectangular chamber perhaps 300 meters in length and 150 wide, with a ceiling high enough that I couldn't see the structural elements without looking for them. The floor was marked with a complex grid of painted lines and zone indicators. Along both long walls, there were observation platforms at multiple heights, connected by external ladders rather than integrated lift systems, which told me something about the design philosophy of the space, about who had built it and what they had prioritized. The equipment staged around the perimeter of the floor was a mixture. Some of it was modern. I recognized Coalition Standard Tactical Analysis terminals, current-generation communications arrays, the kind of portable environmental shielding that any contemporary military unit would deploy before an engagement. But interspersed with all of that was equipment that was older. Much older. Equipment that appeared to have been maintained, kept functional, serviced, cared for but not replaced. A set of field communication units in a style I estimated was at least 60 years behind current standard. Several diagnostic arrays whose interface design I recognized from historical files. And hanging on a rack near the center of the floor, beside the modern suits, and alongside the current generation tactical gear of the rest of Doer's unit, was his armor. In this space, surrounded by all of this equipment, it looked different. It looked like it belonged here in a way it hadn't quite belonged in the ceremonial courtyard. I found myself looking at it with different eyes, though I couldn't have articulated why. Kalindra was already on the observation platform with General Verendry and Field Commander Delm when I arrived. The three of them were talking in low voices, and I could tell from the quality of their conversation, the posture, the eye movement, that this had shifted from social obligation to genuine professional interest. Whatever Kalindra had been thinking since the courtyard, she had shared enough of it that her two most senior military advisors were paying attention. Coordinator Alda stood near the floor entrance and introduced the exercise with the kind of compact precision that I came to understand was very typical of the Coalition's military communication style. No wasted words, no ceremonial framing, just information, delivered at a speed that assumed the listener was keeping up. "What you'll see today is a full defensive response simulation," she said. "Simulated hull breach, hostile insertion, and command protection sequence. Sergeant Major Doer's unit will perform the response. All equipment used will be operational and in the state in which it would be deployed in an actual engagement." She paused just long enough to let that last sentence settle. "That last part is relevant," she added, which was the most understated thing anyone said to us all day. The simulation began. The lights in the lower half of the chamber dropped to roughly 30%, which is the visibility condition you get in an emergency power situation after a hull breach event. Enough to see, not enough to see easily. Somewhere in the walls, a sound system activated that produced not an alarm but the actual acoustic signature of structural stress in a pressurized hull under impact. I had heard that sound in recordings before. It is not a pleasant sound. It is the kind of sound that activates something very old in whatever passes for a nervous system, a sound that communicates something has broken that was supposed to hold, and no amount of knowing it's a simulation entirely removes that response. The opposing force team, 12 soldiers in full current generation tactical gear, armed with training-modified weapons that registered hits without causing damage, entered from 3 points simultaneously. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of a well-trained insertion unit, which is to say that they were very good. The kind of good that comes from working together long enough that the individual decisions become collective, where the team doesn't need to communicate explicitly, because the communication has been absorbed into the movement itself. Doer's unit was already in position. I almost missed how they had gotten there. The chamber had been empty when the simulation started, and then between one moment and the next, Doer's 6-person unit was placed throughout the space with a geometry that I immediately recognized, even from my limited tactical education, as a coverage pattern. They were positioned such that no angle of approach was unobserved, and no line of fire between any two of them was obstructed by the others. They were in a formation that someone had thought about very carefully, and they were in it without having appeared to move into it. Later, reviewing the footage, I would find the moment they had moved. It was early, before the lights dropped, before anyone was specifically watching the floor. Doer had given a signal so small I had to have the footage analyzed to identify it, a shift of his left hand, barely perceptible, and his unit had drifted into position across the following 90 seconds in movements so gradual and so casual that the eye treated them as ordinary. They had been ready before the simulation officially began. They had been ready before anyone knew the parameters. Kalindra saw this too on the footage later. I know because of what she said when she saw it, but that's getting ahead. The contact with the opposing insertion team happened at 4 points nearly simultaneously. The speed of it was something I was not prepared for. I need to be careful here, because I am not a military analyst and I don't want to misrepresent what I saw. What I can describe is what I observed as a witness. And what I observed was Sergeant Major Elias Doer in motion, wearing that old armor, doing things that I would not have predicted from looking at the armor's apparent weight and generation. The first engagement was a hand-to-hand contact situation, 2 members of the opposing team coming around a structural column and meeting 2 of Doer's unit head-on. The exchange lasted approximately 4 seconds and ended with both opposing team members on the floor. I saw the movement, but I could not fully track it. It was too fast and too geometrically complex for my eyes to follow in real time. What I did notice, what struck me first, was the sound the armor made. Modern combat armor, Thesekai or Coalition, is designed to be as acoustically neutral as possible. It moves quietly because sound discipline in an engagement is considered fundamental. You don't announce your movement. You don't give a sound signature that can be tracked. Doer's armor was not quiet. It made sounds not loud, not clattering, but present. Mechanical sounds. The sound of real weight in articulated motion, of materials working against each other in the way that materials with physical mass do when a body inside them moves suddenly. It was a specific, layered sound, and I noticed that the members of the opposing team, trained soldiers, professionals who had been briefed on this exercise, flinched at it. Not much, but they flinched. Field Commander Delm, standing beside me on the observation platform, said something very quietly to General Verendry. I was close enough to hear it. "Acoustic signature," she said. Verendry didn't respond immediately. He was watching the floor. "Tactical use of acoustic signature," Delm said again, and now her voice had a different quality in it. The kind of quality that comes when a trained mind encounters something it has to revise its existing framework to accommodate. Part 3. The generals begin to understand. The simulation ran for 47 minutes. I know the exact duration because I was recording it. It's my job to record things, and when I reviewed the timestamp later, I was surprised by how compressed the time had felt while I was watching. The subjective experience was much shorter. This is a quality that genuinely consequential things often have. They compress time around themselves. You are so fully inside the experience of watching that the normal processing of duration gets bypassed. I will not try to describe every sequence of those 47 minutes in equal detail, because the complete technical description of what Doer's unit did during that exercise is available in the annexed military assessment files that General Verandry and Field Commander Deln submitted 12 days later, and they are far better qualified than I am to translate those actions into the language of tactical analysis. What I will describe is what I observed, and what I observed as it changed the people around me. Around the 12-minute mark, something shifted on the observation platform. Kalindra had been watching with the focused expression she brought to problems she was working through, brows slightly compressed, lips pressed together, the slight forward lean that meant she was tracking details actively rather than passively. But at the 12-minute mark, I saw her posture change. Not dramatically, just a small shift. The forward lean increased, and her head tilted at an angle that suggested recalibration. The angle you see when a person's prediction about what they're watching has turned out to be wrong, and they're adjusting their model. I tracked back to what had been happening on the floor at that moment. Doer had just completed a sequence involving 2 opposition contacts in rapid succession, and in the space between the second contact and his repositioning, he had done something with his left arm, a specific motion that made the pauldron of his armor deploy slightly outward, which redirected the trajectory of a training strike that should have connected and didn't. The pauldron had moved, on its own, in response to something. General Verandry made a sound beside me. Not words, just a sound, the kind a person makes when they've caught themselves right at the edge of an incorrect assumption. "Is that," he started. "Active," Field Commander Deln said. "The armor is active." And that was when the silence on the observation platform changed quality. Because this is what none of us had understood, looking at Doer's armor in the courtyard. We had looked at it and seen the exterior, the mass-density construction, the visible joint articulation, the surface markers of age and obsolescence. We had dated it, assessed it against current standards, and found it lacking. We had done exactly what any competent analyst would do when evaluating equipment based on appearance. We had not looked at what was underneath. The armor was old, that was true, but the systems inside it, the embedded intelligence that had been integrated into its infrastructure across decades of field modification and careful enhancement, were not old. Or rather, they were old in the way that all the best things are old. They had been built to last, and had been tended by people who understood what they were maintaining, and the result was something that looked like one thing and functioned like something else entirely. Coordinator Aldous appeared at the platform entrance. She had been watching us as much as she'd been watching the floor, I realized. There was something deliberate about the way she positioned herself now, close enough to observe our reactions, far enough to give us space to have them. "The armor was first built 93 years ago," she said. Nobody had asked her to speak, but nobody objected. "It was originally designed for a specific operational context, long-duration combat in environments where modern power systems were unreliable. The original design philosophy was durability over elegance." She paused. On the floor below, Doer's unit was completing a containment sequence with a precision that looked like choreography but wasn't. Choreography has a quality of performance to it. What they were doing had a quality of solution, of problems being solved in real time using methods that had been developed across actual experience. "The modifications began after the first deployment cycle," Aldous continued. "The soldier who wore it first, Doer's grandfather, began making adjustments, not to make it look different, not to update its aesthetics, to solve specific problems he'd encountered in the field. He modified the joint tolerances to account for the particular muscle failure pattern that developed after 30 hours of continuous wear. He added a specific type of ceramic overlay to 3 sections of the chest plate after an engagement where a particular type of projectile had found a material weakness. He developed a proprietary internal air circulation system after a mission in a high-humidity environment where the original ventilation was inadequate." Kalindra had turned slightly, not all the way, but her body orientation had shifted to include Aldous in her field of attention. Each generation, Aldous said, added their modifications. Doer's father added the active pauldron system, a neural-responsive mechanism that detects the bioelectric signature of an incoming strike force and deploys preemptively. It took him 11 years to develop and calibrate it correctly. It has a response time that current passive systems cannot match, because passive systems respond to the strike itself. This system responds to the neural pattern that precedes the strike. General Verandry was very still. The integrated acoustic management system, Aldous continued, and now there was something in her voice that I recognized from the very best kind of teacher, from people who know what they know well enough to make the knowing feel like discovery, produces a calibrated sound signature that exploits a known response in the auditory processing of every species in the known galactic contact registry. There are 47 sentient species in our current database. The acoustic frequency profile of this armor produces a threat assessment response in all 47, not panic, not incapacitation, just hesitation. The hesitation lasts between 0.3 and 1.1 seconds, depending on species. Field Commander Deln said something in Thessikai that I won't try to translate, because the closest approximation doesn't do justice to the feeling of the word, which sits somewhere between extraordinary, and I should have seen this coming. How many operational advantages, she said slowly, are built into that armor? Coordinator Aldous looked at her for a moment. We stopped counting, she said, around 30. Part 4. What the armor carries. There is a concept in human culture that I have spent a considerable amount of time studying, because I find it genuinely fascinating in ways that don't entirely translate to Thessikai experience. They call it inheritance. The Thessikai have equivalents, we have lineage, we have legacy, we have the formal structures of institutional memory, but inheritance in the human sense carries something additional. It carries the specific, personal weight of one individual's knowledge and care being passed into the hands of another individual, not as information, not as data, but as object, as thing, as something you can hold. The armor was inheritance. I understood this, in a cognitive sense, before we were taken to the storage and maintenance facility where Doer's unit kept and serviced the equipment. But understanding something in a cognitive sense and understanding it fully are different experiences, and it was the maintenance facility that completed my understanding. Coordinator Aldous brought us there after the simulation concluded, Kailindra, Verandry, Deln, and myself, a small group walking through corridors that gradually transitioned from the flat functional lighting of the exercise areas to something warmer and more deliberate. The maintenance area had the quality of a place that was important to the people who worked in it. It was extremely clean, not sterile, not sanitized, but clean in the way that things are clean when the people caring for them have very specific feelings about their condition. Every surface had the kind of attention that reflects consideration rather than compliance. The armor was already there when we arrived. 2 members of Doer's unit were working on it, one at the chest plate, one at the gauntlet assembly, and they worked with the particular combination of precision and calm that you see in people who have done something so many times that competence and comfort have become the same state. But there was something else in the way they worked that I noticed, and it took me a moment to identify it. They were careful with it, not careful in the technical sense, not the carefulness of managing fragile or dangerous material, careful in the way you are with something that matters. There was a gentleness in the handling that existed alongside the technical competence rather than being explained by it. Sergeant Major Doer was there, out of the armor now, in a simple working uniform. Without the armor, he looked like what he was, a middle-aged man, compact and capable, with a face that had seen considerable weather. He looked at our group with an expression that was entirely neutral, which I had come to understand was its own form of communication. Kailindra looked at him for a moment, then she looked at the armor on the workbench. How old did she say it was? She asked, not to anyone in particular. She was looking at the diagonal score across the chest plate. 93 years, I said. She nodded slowly. And how long has your family had it? Doer looked at her. His voice, when he spoke, was the kind of voice that had spent most of its life giving information rather than impressions, matter of fact, even pitched to carry but not to perform. It was built for my grandfather, he said. He wore it for 19 years. My father wore it for 22. I've worn it for 31. The math worked out to 72 years of continuous active use, with 21 years of the armor's age unaccounted for modifications, engineering, preparation, before the first wearing. Kailindra did the math too. I watched her do it. 31 years, she said. Yes. She looked at the armor again, at the scratches and the burned shadows and the hand-painted unit identifiers on the gauntlets. Those marks. Yes. Are they? Do you know what each one is from? Doer looked at the armor. There was something in his expression that I found very difficult to describe then and still find difficult to describe now. It wasn't pride, exactly. It wasn't nostalgia. It was something quieter than both of those and more permanent. The diagonal across the chest, he said, that was my grandfather's. Close contact engagement in an orbital station breach, year 12 of the Karendi conflict. The blade was bonded composite, moving at approximately 60 meters per second. The armor stopped it. He had 3 broken ribs from the impact force. He paused. He considered having the mark repaired, decided not to. Nobody spoke. The burned shadows on the right pauldron, he continued. That was my father's. Directed energy discharge, year 3 of the Theshan incursion. The pauldron redirected the residual discharge away from his primary sensors. He was at full operational capacity 15 seconds after the hit. Another pause. He didn't consider having that mark repaired. He turned to look at the gauntlets, where 2 of his unit were still working. The marks on the gauntlets, he said, are mine. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. General Verendry had been standing very quietly for several minutes. He was the most senior military mind in our group, and the most disciplined at not revealing his internal process, an essential skill for someone who had spent 40 years as a general officer. But something had gotten past his discipline. I could see it in the way he was holding his shoulders, in the quality of his stillness, which had changed from the formal neutrality of a military posture to something more like the stillness of genuine engagement. General, he said, and his voice was very even. How many active operational systems does this armor currently carry? Doer thought for a moment. Not the way you think when you don't know the answer, the way you think when the answer requires organization. 34, he said. 11 defensive, 8 offensive support, 7 environmental, 6 communication, 2 that don't have a standard category. 2 that don't have a category. My grandfather invented them, Doer said. We never found a comparable system in any existing classification taxonomy. Verendry looked at him for a long moment. What do they do? One of them detects a specific bioelectric signature pattern associated with the pre-attack neural state in 12 of the 47 registered sentient species, Doer said. It gives me approximately 0.4 seconds of advance information before a physical attack is initiated. He paused. The other one, he said, I'd rather not describe in detail at this stage of our relationship. Verendry almost smiled. The almost smile of a professional who has just discovered that someone else at the table is also a professional, in the deepest sense of the word. Fair enough, he said. Part 5, the princess's question. I almost wasn't in the room when the conversation between Kailindra and Doer happened. After Verendry and Deln had spent approximately an hour in technical discussion with Doer and 2 of his unit's engineers, A conversation that I followed at the level of someone who understands that something extraordinary is being discussed without being able to entirely follow the technical vocabulary. The group had naturally separated. Verendry and Deln had gone with the engineers to review documentation. Aldous had been drawn into a communication from the Diplomatic Coordination Office. I had stepped briefly into the corridor to update my notes. When I returned, Kailindra and Doer were alone in the room. I stopped in the doorway, not because I was trying to eavesdrop, or not only because of that, but because the quality of the scene held me. There was something in the configuration of those two people, the princess standing in front of the workbench where the armor lay, and the soldier standing a few meters away, that had a specific gravity to it. The kind of scene that you can tell is happening at a depth that doesn't get reached often. Kailindra was looking at the armor. She had her hands clasped behind her back, which was her habitual posture when she was thinking seriously rather than performing seriousness. "I made an assumption," she said. Her voice was quiet, not ashamed. Kailindra was not someone who did public shame, but direct in a way that was more honest than a lot of the public directness she deployed. Doer was looking at the armor too. "People generally do," he said, not dismissive. Not magnanimous either, just honest. "I looked at it and I thought about what it wasn't," she said. "All the ways it was behind, all the things it couldn't do by current standards. I was very accurate about what I observed." "You were," he said, "and completely wrong about what it meant." He was quiet for a moment. The observation wasn't wrong, it was incomplete. She looked at him. "What's the difference in your field?" "In my field," he said, "an incomplete observation gets people killed, so we train against it specifically. We practice, constantly, deliberately, the habit of not stopping the observation when you found what you expected to find. The thing that kills you is almost never the thing that looks dangerous. It's the thing that looks like something you've already categorized." Kailindra was quiet for a moment. On the workbench, the armor lay with its chest plate faintly catching the light, the diagonal mark across it like a line drawn by something that had meant to end everything and hadn't. "Your grandfather," she said, "the soldier who built it, why didn't he just request current generation equipment?" Doer's expression shifted. Not much, but something in it changed, and what replaced it was complex, the kind of complex that takes a long time to make. "He tried," he said. "3 times, the requests were denied. Allocation priorities, production bottlenecks, unit classification issues. There was always a reason, so he stopped requesting and started building." He paused. By the time the allocation issues were resolved and they offered him new equipment, he turned it down. Why? Because by then, what he had was better than what they were offering. Kailindra absorbed this. "Better," she said. "For the specific things he needed it to do," Doer said. "Current generation equipment is very good at the things current generation equipment is designed to do. My grandfather's armor is very good at the things my grandfather discovered you actually needed, which turned out to be somewhat different." There was a long pause. "That's not a lesson they teach at the academy," Kailindra said. "No," Doer said, "it isn't." "What do they teach?" "Standard doctrine, current equipment. Best practices as defined at the moment of standardization." He looked at the armor. "The problem is that reality doesn't care about the moment of standardization. Reality is a continuous process. The best practices that were best when they were defined are not always best when you actually need them." Kailindra looked at him directly. "You're not just talking about the armor." "No," he said, "I'm not." Another silence, different quality than the one before, the kind that comes after something true has been said. "I laughed at it," Kailindra said. "In the courtyard you heard me." "Yes. I'm sorry." He looked at her, and something in his expression, the weathered, steady surface of it, shifted into something that was not quite a smile, but contained everything a smile contains. "The armor has been laughed at before," he said. "It's still here." Part 6, the report. What followed in the next 12 days is documented in the official HFY Diplomatic Archive under file reference 7TCA44, and the military assessment documents that General Verendry and Field Commander Deln submitted to the Chancellor's office are available in their complete form in the annexed Military Intelligence Repository. Cross-reference. Human Coalition, Armor Systems, Historical Modification Programs. I will summarize only the parts that are directly relevant to what this document is trying to preserve. Verendry and Deln requested and were granted access to comprehensive technical documentation on Doer's armor, not to replicate it, but to understand the design philosophy that had produced it. They spent 4 days with the engineering team going through every modification made across 3 generations, every operational insight that had driven each change, every field-discovered problem that had generated a field-invented solution. Their report to Chancellor Amara Salandris was 47 pages long, which for Verendry was extraordinary. His reports typically ran to 12 pages at most, because he considered anything beyond that to be the analyst failing the reader. The 47 pages were necessary because what he was describing didn't fit comfortably into existing HFY military doctrine, and describing it required building new analytical frameworks first before you could explain what you were analyzing. The summary section of that report, which I was given access to in preparation for this document, contains a passage that I want to reproduce here because it captures something I've struggled to articulate in my own words. The armor designated by the coalition as Doer Family Service Piece, Mark I through Mark XXVII, represents a category of military asset that our current classification taxonomy does not adequately describe. It is not equipment in the conventional sense, because conventional equipment is manufactured to specification and distributed to users who have no relationship with its development. It is not a prototype, because it has been deployed continuously in active service across 72 years. It is something else entirely, a living record of operational knowledge, accumulated across 3 generations of continuous engagement with actual combat conditions, built into a physical form that can be worn. The 34 operational systems currently integrated into this armor were not developed by engineers working from theoretical requirements. They were developed by soldiers who had encountered specific problems in actual engagements and had the knowledge, the time, and the commitment to solve them. The solutions are therefore not theoretically optimal, they are practically optimal, which is a fundamentally different category. What this armor contains, in essence, is 93 years of things that actually worked. We have no equivalent in our own inventory. We have sophisticated equipment. We have well-resourced development programs. We have talent and infrastructure that this family never had access to. And yet what they produced, with limited resources and across 3 generations of personal investment, is more operationally effective in several specific categories than anything we currently field. This is not an embarrassment. It is a lesson about the difference between theoretical knowledge and the kind of knowledge that is earned. The Chancellor's response to that report, I am told, was brief. She read it, she put it down, she sat quietly for a moment. And then she said, "Get me General Verendry, and find me Elias Doer's contact information." Part 7, What the Armor Taught the Confederacy. I want to be careful here, because what followed is the part of this story that has been most subject to mythologization, and the myth version, while satisfying, misses what was actually significant about it. The myth version goes, the HFY Confederacy examined Doer's armor, recognized its superiority, immediately began replicating its design philosophy across their entire military program, and everything became better. That's the myth. It's clean and it has a narrative shape that feels conclusive. What actually happened was messier and more interesting. The first thing that happened was a meeting between Chancellor Amara Salandris, General Verandry, Field Commander Delm, and Sergeant Major Elias Doer that lasted 6 hours. I was not in that meeting. Nobody outside the room was in that meeting, and the official records of it are still partially restricted. What I know about its contents comes from things that Kailindra, who was also present, told me later, under the condition that I would not attribute specific statements to specific people. What I can say is that the discussion was not primarily about the armor's technical systems. It was about the process that had produced the technical systems. The philosophy, if you can call it that, and Doer himself would probably resist the word because it sounds more organized and deliberate than what he'd describe as figuring out what we actually needed, behind the multi-generational modification approach. The specific way in which operational experience, when it is genuinely attended to and recorded and acted upon, produces a kind of knowledge that centralized development programs almost never generate. The second thing that happened was that Kailindra requested and was granted a personal meeting with Doer that was not part of the formal diplomatic program. I don't know entirely what they discussed in that meeting either, because Kailindra was discreet about it in a way she wasn't always discreet about things. What I know is that, when she came back from it, something in her bearing was different. Not dramatically. Kailindra was not a person who underwent dramatic visible transformations. But the quality of her attention in subsequent meetings was changed, slower somehow, more willing to wait for a thing to show itself before assessing it. This is, I have always believed, the most significant thing that the armor gave the Confederacy. Not the technical specifications, those were valuable but ultimately translatable into engineering language. What the armor gave the Confederacy was a lesson in what it means to actually pay attention, to maintain the observation past the point of initial categorization, to understand that the most important things are often the things that don't look important at first. The third thing that happened is documented in the military records and doesn't require my interpretation. The Thessikai Confederacy initiated a program, under General Verandry's oversight, to systematically collect and codify the operational knowledge held by long-serving soldiers at every rank level. Not their formal training records, not their performance evaluations. Their actual knowledge, the things they had figured out in the field that weren't in any manual, the adaptations and modifications and workarounds they had developed because the standard approach hadn't worked and something else had. The program produced what eventually became the Thessikai Operational Experience Archive, which by my last knowledge was one of the most comprehensive military knowledge repositories in the Confederacy's history. It was built because of an old man in old armor. Part 8, the last thing I remember. I saw Doer once more before we left Kervith Station. It was the morning of our departure, the last formal event before the delegation boarded our transport, a brief ceremony in one of the station's public concourses where the diplomatic teams exchanged final acknowledgments. Kailindra gave her formal address, measured and appropriately conciliatory. The coalition's diplomatic representatives gave theirs. There were handshakes and formal gestures in the several formats required by protocol when multiple species are present. Doer was there, but not in a formal capacity. He was in the concourse by what appeared to be coincidence, a soldier moving through a public area on the way to somewhere else, wearing his armor. He always wore his armor in operational areas. I had come to understand that. It wasn't ceremonial, it was functional. The armor was his equipment. He wore it the way a tool is meant to be used. Kailindra saw him from across the concourse. He saw her too. Neither of them altered their course or their pace, but as they passed, she moving toward the transport gates, he moving toward wherever he was going, they exchanged something. I was close enough to see it but not close enough to hear it if anything was said. What I saw was Kailindra pause for just a moment. Doer pause for just a moment. A brief exchange, a few words perhaps, or perhaps no words at all, just the mutual acknowledgement of people who have understood something together. And then they continued in their separate directions. I've thought about that moment many times since, about what was exchanged in it, about what kind of understanding it represented, the young princess who had laughed, and the middle-aged soldier who had heard her, and the 60 hours between those two moments in which the universe had, in its patient way, done what it always does. Made the truth available to whoever was willing to look at it. The armor caught the station light as Doer walked away from me, the diagonal mark on the chest plate, the burned shadows on the pauldron, the hand-painted identifiers on the gauntlets, small and precise and personal. 93 years of history, worn by the body of someone who had added his own marks to it. 34 systems that the galaxy didn't have a category for. 3 generations of a family, deciding every day to maintain something rather than discard it, because they understood that what it contained was worth carrying forward. In HFY, the word for inheritance, the word we invented after that day, is built from 3 root concepts: what was given, what is carried, and what will be given again. There is no equivalent concept for the thing simply being lost. The language doesn't have room for it, because the people who built the word couldn't conceive of a keeper choosing not to keep. I understand that differently now than I did before that trip. I understand a lot of things differently. Epilogue, recovered notation, KALNDRATHSSVURN, personal field log. Written approximately 18 months after the Kervith Station visit. Declassified by personal request of Chancellor Kailindra Thesivorn, year 12 post-contact, in conjunction with the publication of the HFY Operational Experience Archive. The hardest thing I've had to train out of myself, harder than any physical skill, harder than any tactical pattern, is the habit of finished observation. We are taught to evaluate, we are taught to assess. We are taught to take the information that a thing presents and derive a conclusion from it. This is essential. This is the foundation of strategic thinking. I don't argue with this. What I argue with now is the moment of stopping. The moment when you've gathered enough information to form a conclusion and you form it and the observation ends. Because that moment, that specific, quiet moment of, I know what this is the most dangerous moment in any assessment. Not because the conclusion is necessarily wrong, but because the conclusion once formed closes the attention. And the attention, once closed, stops receiving. I stood in a courtyard, and I looked at a man in old armor, and I formed a conclusion about it in about 4 seconds. My conclusion was technically accurate and operationally useless, because what I had actually observed was a surface, and I had mistaken the surface for the thing. Sergeant Major Doer told me in the maintenance facility that the thing that kills you is almost never the thing that looks dangerous. It's the thing that looks like something you've already categorized. I've been thinking about that ever since. In the last 18 months, I've found at least 12 situations in which I can directly trace a strategic error, my own or someone else's, to the moment of finished observation, to the moment when someone knew enough to have a conclusion and concluded. I've also found 3 situations in which I caught the error before it became a decision, because I had trained myself to ask, after forming a conclusion, what am I not looking at? 3 catches out of 12 potential errors is not a good ratio. I am still practicing. But 3 catches that might have been 0 is a beginning, and beginnings matter. The armor is still in service. I checked before authorizing this document's release. Sergeant Major Doer is still wearing it. It is now 94 years old by the date of manufacture of the original chest plate, though every other component has been modified to various degrees at various points in its history. And the question of what it means for an object to have an age when all its components have been replaced or altered at different times is a philosophical question I leave to people more philosophically inclined than I am. What I know is that when I checked on its current status, the briefing officer described it as fully operational, 35 active systems, field ready. 35. Dower had added one since I'd last seen him. I asked what the new system did. The briefing officer read the technical description and then paused. "I'm not sure we have a category for it," he said. I smiled. "Of course you don't.